Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to be starting the unit negative numbers, addition, and subtraction. Today I'm going to go over some vocabulary with you, and then we're going to talk about the first three skills of this unit, which are signs of sums, adding negative numbers, and lastly, missing numbers on the number lines. So let's go back and start with some vocabulary. The first thing I want to talk about is what is an integer? By now, in previous grades, you've talked about whole numbers and you've talked about natural numbers. Now we're going to get into integers. So the definition for an integer is it's a whole number anywhere from 0 to positive or negative infinity. And below that, you can see there is a set of integers as well as a number line. So any integer is going to include 0, 1, -1, 2, -2, 3, -3, and it goes on to infinity in both directions. The next term I want to go over is opposites. When we refer to opposite numbers, we are referring to numbers that are the same distance from 0 on a number line. So for example, -5 and +5 would be considered opposite numbers because as you can see, +5 is 5 units from 0 and -5 is also 5 units from 0 on the number line. And the opposite of 0 is simply just going to be 0. The last term I want to talk to you about is what's called an additive inverse. It's basically another term that we use to refer to opposites. Basically, your additive inverse means that if you take opposite numbers like -5 and +5 and you add them together, you will always get 0, or 14 and -14. So in other words, whatever you add to a number to get 0 is what we call an additive inverse. If I have the number 20, its additive inverse would be -20. If I have the number -10, its additive inverse would be +10. Okay, so let's start with signs of sums. So it says, what is the sign of -201 plus 189? Now, we haven't gone over the integer rules yet, but the way I like to describe this is, think of if you were to put, use a balance scale like you would in science class. If I were to put 201 negatives on one side of my balance scale and then 189 positives on the other, which one's going to weigh more? Well, I have more negatives, which means that's going to weigh more. So if I were to add these two together, I would end up having more negatives than positives, making my final answer a negative. Let's take a look at this one. What is the sign of -567.45 plus 567.45? Well, the first thing I want to ask you is, what do you notice about these numbers? They are the same numbers, but one is positive and one is negative, which means that they are opposites or additive inverses. And as we just went over, whenever you add additive inverses together, we will always get 0. The last one here, you can see that you have a vertical number line. So I'm going to take a look at where B is on my number line. It's at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's at 5 at my number line. And then if we count down to where A is, we're going down from 0, which means we're in the negative side. So this would be -1, -2, -3, -4, -5, -6, -7, -8. So you can see that A is at -8. Again, think about putting both of these numbers on that scale. If I were to put 5 positives on one side and 8 negatives on the other, which would weigh more? Clearly, you have more negatives, so that would weigh more, which means that your answer would be a negative. And then the last one, we have fractions. Fractions are obviously a little bit more complicated to deal with, but let's think about this. It says, what is the sign of 37/4 plus -27/22? Notice I have a hint there at the bottom that says, how do we determine which is bigger? Well, the one thing we could do is we could convert them to decimals, but that could be a little bit complicated because then you're dealing with division. The other thing we could do is we could convert them to mixed numbers, which is probably the easiest solution. So as you can recall, to convert something to a mixed number, you're just going to divide your numerator by your denominator. 4 goes into 37 9 times, and that's going to leave me with a remainder of 1. So that means that I have a mixed number of 9 and 1/4 plus, let's do the same thing over here. 22 goes into 27 one time with a remainder of 5. So that's going to leave me with a negative 1 and 5 over 22. So now this is a little bit easier. Think about it. If I were to put 9 1/4 positives on one side and 1 and 5/22 negatives on the other, clearly your positives are going to outweigh your negatives, which means that if I were to add these two together, I would end up with a positive answer. Okay, let's get into some adding negative number problems. So this is the first integer rule that you're going to learn for addition. It's basically a song. It goes to the tune of Row, Row, Row Your Boat, which you can always sing to yourself in your head if you like. But basically it says same sign, add and keep, different sign, subtract. Keep the sign of which has more, and then you'll be exact. It might not be a bad idea to write this down in your notes just so that you have it when you're working on these problems. And what that is basically saying is if you're adding two integers and they're both positive or they are both negative, you're going to, if they're, see, it says same sign, add and keep. So let's say I have negative 2 plus negative 3. Well, they're both negatives, so I'm going to add and keep my sign. So 2 plus 3 is 5, and I'm going to keep my sign. Different signs, subtract. Keep the sign of which has more, then you'll be exact. Well, let's try a subtraction one. Let's say I have negative 7 plus 9. Well, 7 is clearly negative and 9 is positive. So those are different signs. So I'm going to subtract them. 9 minus 7 is 2. And then notice it says, keep the sign of which has more. Well, do I have more positives or negatives here? Think about that scale again. If I put 7 negatives on one side and 9 positives on the other, which one's going to weigh more? Clearly your positives, which means my answer is going to be a positive 2. Okay, let's try some practice ones here. So I've got negative 6 plus 4. Think about your rules. These are different signs, which means I'm going to subtract them. 6 minus 4 is 2. And then I can see that I have more negatives than I have positives, which makes my answer a negative. Example 2, again, we have 2 plus negative 10, so I have different signs. One's a positive and one's a negative. Different signs means we subtract. So I've got 10 minus 2 is 8. And again, I have 2 positives and 10 negatives. I have more negatives than positives, which means my answer is going to be a negative. Example 3, both are negatives, which means they're same signs. And if you look back at the rhyme, it says same signs, we add and keep our sign. So 9 plus 5 is 14, and I'm going to keep my negative sign. Now notice over here it says interactive integers. You can always use positive and negative symbols to help you do these problems as you're learning the rules. So for example, I'm going to draw 6 negatives, and then I'm going to draw 4 positives. Now, as we can recall, a negative and a positive together equals 0. Negative 1 and positive 1, those are additive inverses. That would mean this positive would go with that negative, that positive would go with that negative, and that positive would go with that negative, leaving 2 negatives, hence how we got negative 2. We could try it for this one also. I have 2 positives, and then I've got 10 negatives. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Well, this positive would go there. That positive would go with that negative. And then what's left over? If I count my negatives, you'll see that I'm left with 8 negatives. Hence why my answer is negative 8. And then the last one. If I've got 5 negatives here, doesn't want to see, doesn't want to stay. So let's try it over here. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then I'm going to do plus my 9 negatives. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Notice that I have no positives here. So I'm not going to be able to make any zero pairs, which means I'm going to take these 5 negatives and these 9 negatives and just add them together, giving me negative 14. So if that helps you in the beginning while you're learning your integer rules, you can always draw your pluses and your minuses to help make your zero pairs. However, as we get into more difficult problems like negative 78 plus 96, you're probably not going to want to draw 76 negatives and 98 positives. So, but in the beginning, to get used to your integer rules, you can always do that. Okay, so we've got negative 3 plus negative 2. These are same signs, we add and keep. So 3 plus 2 is 5, and I'm going to keep my negative sign. Okay, if we want to draw the negatives, I have 3 negatives plus 2 negatives. There's no zero pairs, so I'm left with 5 negatives total. 5 plus negative 4. The next example, I've got different signs. So our rule tells us different signs we subtract. 5 minus 4 is 1. And then you just need to ask yourself, what do we have more of? Well, clearly I have more positives than negatives, which means my answer is a positive. Let's draw our pluses and minuses. I've got 5 positives and I've got 4 negatives. If I were to make my zero pairs, notice that I've got 1 positive left over, hence why our answer is a positive 1. Okay, let's try the next one. I've got negative 8 plus 3. Those are different signs. One is negative and one is positive. Our rule says different signs we subtract. 8 minus 3 is 5. And clearly we have more negatives than positives, so my answer would be a negative 5. Again, drawing our zero pairs, I've got 8 negatives. And I've got 3 positives. Let's make our zero pairs. And then let's see what we have left over. And clearly you can see we have 5 negatives left over. Okay, the last skill we're going to talk about is missing numbers on the number line. It says the blue dot is at what value on the number line? Well, the first thing you need to notice is that they're giving you 7 and they're giving you 9. So clearly that means this number in between them is going to be an 8. And then you just can count back using your tick marks. Clearly the one to the left of 7 would be 6, 5, 4, making the question mark clearly 3. Let's try another one of those. So here we're on the negative side of our number line, and they're giving us negative 10 and negative 16, and then we see that there's this one little tick mark in between them. So clearly that tick mark in between them is going to be your halfway point. Negative 10 and negative 16 are separated by 6 units. So that means that your tick mark in the middle would represent 3 units in between them. So negative 10, that would make it negative 13, and then negative 16. So basically each tick mark here on this number line represents 3 units. So that's going to be negative 10, negative 13, negative 16. 3 more units to the left of negative 16 is going to be negative 19. As you can see, we're just counting in threes, which makes our question mark negative 22. Okay, now we've got a vertical number line. The numbers given are negative 6 and negative 10, which those are 4 units apart. So that means that each of these tick marks represents 2 units. So that means that the number here in the middle would be negative 8. And now we're going upwards, which means we're getting closer to 0. So that means that negative 6, after negative 6 would be negative 4, then negative 2, making our question mark 0. Okay, again, we've got negative 4 and negative 10. Those are separated by 6 units, which means each tick mark represents 3 units. So if I were to go 3 units to the left of negative 4, I would be at negative 7. 3 units to the left of negative 7 would be negative 10, which makes this next one negative 13. Then after that, negative 16, which means our question mark would be negative 19. Okay, that does it for the first 3 skills. The correlating note-taking packet pages are going to be pages 1 through 5, just to the top of the page on page 5. You can email myself or Mr. Lab with any questions that you may have. Have a great day, everyone.